Do fairies have a sense of humour? Ever wondered what makes them laugh? I've often suspected if, at least sometimes, fairy interact with us purely for their own entertainment. This would explain a lot. Many reported encounters with fairy are so bizarre, so nonsensical, that it seems the best explanation. G'day, I'm Kitty, and this is Fairy Encounters. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And for old friends, come sit down next to me because I've got some fabulous true stories to share with you. Let's jump right into this experience, which was recorded in County Donegal, Ireland. In the time of my grandfather, there was a man and his wife lived in Glenkeen. They always had exactly 12 spoons in their home, but these spoons began to disappear one by one. Of course, they looked high and low, but couldn't find a single missing spoon. Then, one night, they realised there was not one spoon left for them to eat their supper. Well, their supper was ready for the eating, and the couple sat at the table, bewildered, when suddenly the door of their cottage opened and in flew a spoon, as though thrown by someone. Immediately after, a second spoon was tossed into the room, followed by a third and fourth, and so on until all the 12 spoons were back. And as the very last spoon came flying through the empty doorway, they clearly heard laughing out in the field in front of their house. They knew then it was the fairies were having a joke at their expense. Well, this was a soft one to kick off the video. It was a fairly harmless sort of trick. The fairy obviously delighted in watching this bewildered couple over the course of a few days or maybe even weeks, but there was no real harm done. And of course, it did give the old couple a great story to tell. Now, this next account of a fairy trick, well, it raises the stakes a bit. Take a look. A man, Edward Kavanagh of Glack, went out to the hill to check after his sheep. As he reached the top of the hill, he met 2 odd men that he had never seen before. The men took him by the arms and put him down, sitting behind a rush bush. And there he sat. He found he could not move and could not speak. Soon, all the local people went out looking for Kavanagh. Up and down the hills and in nearby waters they went, and not a one could see him anywhere. For 2 days the people of the parish searched for Kavanagh. At the end of 2 days, one of them went to the priest. Well, the priest told them that Kavanagh was not drowned and he was not lost, but that he was sitting behind a rush bush in Nelson's field, and if he was not got before the sun set on the following evening, that he would come home himself. On the following evening, as the sun was setting, all the people were watching for him, and suddenly saw him appear, walking down Nelson's field. All the people were glad to have him back and desperately wanted to know what had happened to him. He told them that as he was going up the side of the hill, 2 strange young men took him and left him behind a rush bush. He said he watched all the people running around looking for him for 2 days, but he could not rise from where he was sitting or even speak to them. Though he was clearly there all the while, the people were unable to see him at all. When he arose the next morning, Kavanagh was blind of one eye. It was believed if he had kept the fairies' prank a secret, not told where he was or what happened to him, he would not have been blinded. So we can easily imagine that the fairy were greatly entertained by their game, watching humans scurry around for days, hopelessly looking for one of their own. It seems the trick was done and dusted until the player, in this situation Kavanagh, revealed what had happened. And as they say, it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. An interesting point in this experience is the advice from the priest. Again, we find a very strange, uneasy sort of understanding between the fairy folk and the clergy. This pops up quite often in encounters with the fairy folk. Well, here's another recorded encounter which just reeks of the fairies having a good giggle at the expense of a farmer. A man lived in Glen Keane with his wife and young family. He had only one cow, and one day he was shocked to discover that she had been stolen, or so he had thought. The following evening, he saw his cow grazing at Cruckaleen Rock. He went towards her and watched as she disappeared into the rock. So he returned the next evening, and there she was again. This time, though, he got himself between the cow and the rock. The cow made a dive past him and got between the man and the rock. He grasped at the cow and managed to get a hold of the cow's tail, but the rest of the cow disappeared into the rock, leaving the tail in the man's hands. He swore out loud to all who were listening that he would come back the next day and blast that rock to pieces if the fairies did not leave back his cow. Imagine his surprise to find the cow at the byre door, safe and sound, when he went home that evening. I find that tale, excuse the pun, strangely reassuring. It appears that the fairy who took the man's cow had their fun, but knew well enough when to end the joke. The Cruckaleen Rock was clearly important to the fairy and wasn't worth pursuing or escalating things with the farmer. In this next account, we find the fairy sending a man a firm, unmistakable warning, but not without humour. A man named Callahan lived in Glenaganon. Now he had a field with a big rock in it, and close by this rock was a hedge. All the local people knew that every evening the fairies danced around this big rock. One day, Callahan declared that he was going to take away this rock and remove the hedge too. Many tried to talk him out of such needless and reckless action. Even a priest who lived in the town told him not to interfere with the rock. But, as they say, some people just won't be told. Callahan would not listen to reason, and soon after began to cut the hedge. And as soon as he began, a swarm of white rats rushed out of the hedge. Callahan began to throw stones at them to frighten them away, but it was no use. They ran circles around him. Then one of the white rats put its own tail in its mouth and began to whistle. In less than a minute, there were thousands of white rats circling around Callahan and the stone. Callahan ran through the white rats and away out of the field in fright. He went to the priest and told him all that had happened, and the priest said it was the fairies themselves had sent the rats. Callahan never again touched the hedge or the rock. We can imagine the fairy enjoyed a mighty belly laugh at Callahan's expense that day. I can't say I blame them, actually. He wasn't hurt at all, and their antics taught him not only a valuable lesson, but I think they had a certain flair too. What do you think? I have 3 more highly strange encounters with Tricky Fairy for you. But right now, please check that you're subscribed and have hit that notifications bell. I'm working hard to bring these true stories to life and release a new video every week. And I respond really well to encouragement, so please go ahead and give me a sweet thumbs up too. I'd really appreciate it. About 50 years ago, 2 men from Ballywilly were returning home from morning mass on a Sunday and walked up to the hill for to look at their sheep. When they were going around Craignave, they saw a house which they knew was never there before. The men stood for a while, wondering what to do. They knew well enough what their eyes were seeing, but knew too that all was not as it should be. Eventually, they decided to take a look and approached the strange house. The 2 men entered the door and saw, to their astonishment, an old woman sitting hunched at the fire. It was a scene they had witnessed countless times before: 4 children playing on the ground and a young woman making dinner. The house looked to be just an ordinary country house. Then the young woman spoke to them, just as any person would, telling them to sit at the fire and wait till her husband came. At that moment, the old woman turned her head and signalled to the men silently not to sit, but for them to go back out the door. This they did, and were not 3 yards from the door when they turned back round to find there was nothing to be seen. The house and all its occupants were gone. There was nothing but the green field they had known, or thought they had known so well. Many later said that had they waited until the husband came, they would never have gotten out. There was a man in this district named Joseph McCabe who was lonely, but had no luck in finding a suitable wife. He was going across Lurganboy Fort one day in a very sad state, and a fairy approached him from within the fort. The fairy spoke up and said to him, "I know you are want of a wife. I will get you a wife." Not long after, she did as she promised and brought to him a lovely woman that he had never seen in the district before. They were married soon after, and when they were married for a couple of months, they were invited to a party. At tea, the man dropped his fork and his wife stooped down to lift it for him. When he again looked at her, she was a wee woman with only one tooth. When poor Joseph saw her, he ran out screaming. He went mad and went to fight the fairies who had played such a horrid trick on him. Instead of fighting the fairies, it was a pit of potatoes he was hammering. When morning came, he had 2 pits of potatoes destroyed in his anger. Long ago, it was common for people in Ireland going to England to walk their way to Drogheda in County Louth, and it was from there that they would sail. So it was a man named James Brennan from Mullinabrina set off on his journey to Drogheda. He walked at a fairly brisk pace, and as he was nearing Gerteen, at a place called Tonnagh Bridge, he saw a big house all lighted up, and as he was passing it, 2 boys walked out and invited him into the dance. He did so, and as he entered, his eyes were dazzled by the bright light. He talked away to the people, although he knew none of them, and after a while he was brought into a beautiful room in which there was a table covered with all sorts of eatables. There he was given plenty to eat and drink. After that was over, he went back to where the dance was in full swing. He had thoroughly enjoyed it, but he noticed one peculiarity about it, for through the night every of the fairy that he asked the time answered 1:30, although he knew it was near daylight. He began to think of continuing his journey, and no sooner had the thought entered his head than the dance broke up and the house disappeared, and he found himself standing inside the ditch at Tonnagh Bridge in clear daylight. He then returned home a very dejected man, as it was too late to continue his journey. He had realized by that time that the house was nothing more than a fairy trick, for to prevent him from continuing on his way. When it comes to the fairy and their sense of humour, it can be innocent, to be sure, but I liken it to a cat playing with a mouse. Maybe after they've had their fun, they'll just tire of it and move on, but maybe they'll just keep playing until their plaything gets hurt, or worse. What do you think? Please share your thoughts and ideas in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd like to send warm thanks to my channel members and patrons, because it's their support which has made this video possible. I'll be back next week with a shiny new video. I hope you'll join me. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio.